On this episode of Steve Magnanti's Supermodels, it's 1969, and we're kicking butt on the Detroit Woodward Avenue street racing scene in a factory-backed Hemi GTX. Life is good. This may come as no surprise, but I've been a car guy for my entire life. And if you're like me, the passion started with plastic model kits. On this show, we'll be building replicas of some of the greatest cars in history, but for the most part, we'll be leaving the instruction sheet in the box. Instead, we use creativity, ingenuity, and mixing parts from this kit and that kit to get the best, most fun replica we can. And if you know me, there will be some stories to tell. So grab your dream car and your sharpest hobby knife. We've got dreams to build. On this episode of Steve Magnanti's Supermodels, we're going street racing. No, we're not going to risk our driver's license. Rather, we're going to do it in 1/25th scale by replicating a classic street racer from Detroit's Woodward Avenue. Now, back in the day, in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, Detroit automakers actually sponsored drag race cars that competed on Woodward Avenue, well, to race and to get bragging rights. In Pontiac world, we had Jim Wangers driving Ram Air 4 GTOs. John Vermeersch, a prominent Ford executive, had an overhead cam-powered Galaxy. And in the world of Mopar, there was the Silver Bullet. A fellow named Jimmy Addison was the driver of this car, and what Plymouth basically did was provide him with the latest Hemi parts and suspension parts for him to test out on the streets of Woodward Avenue against the competition. And what we're going to do today is replicate that car in 1/25th scale using Revell's 1967 GTX model. But this one replicates Sox and Martin's red, white, and blue Superstock D GTX, which is actually a Plymouth RO23 Superstocker. But that's cool. It's a great model, but we're not going to go that way with it. And keep in mind, too, while this kit is out of production, today you can still buy the 67 GTX from Revell. It has all the same parts, the RO23 Superstock goodies, but it doesn't have Sox and Martin's decals. But none of that matters to us right now because, again, we're going to be utilizing vintage magazines to get all the details of Jimmy Addison's Silver Bullet and replicate it in 1/25th scale. Yeah, the best thing about this model is it's molded in white plastic, but beyond that, it's really crisp. The proportions are good. It has inner fender detail, but not too much stuff molded in. In other words, a lot of separate parts, which helps the realism, which is really, really good. The chassis is looking good. It even has the torque boxes you'd find on a Hemi car, so that's a nice plus. The interior is a little bit problematic for our application because it has a rear bench seat and these heavy GTX front buckets. Now, we know that Jimmy Addison did not run a back seat and he used lightweight front seats. More on that in a minute. We'll fix it. The engine is very good. It's a 426 Hemi, but the difference here is that while the Revell GTX gives you a 4-speed transmission, the A833 Hemi 4-speed, Addison used an automatic, a 727 torque flight, so we'll address that. The wheels supplied here, again, you have to remember that Sox and Martin were in part sponsored by Keystone. So the kit has Keystone Classic mags, which are nice, but incorrect. Jimmy Addison used Krager's. We'll also address that. And finally, the tires in this kit, for whatever reasons, Revell gave it radials, Goodyear radial tires up front, which are too modern and too wide to be correct for Jimmy Addison's car. And at the rear, these are a set of Goodyear slicks. They're pretty good, but we can do better. And again, we'll raid the parts box to get good slicks. So the 67 GTX by Revell is a good jumping off point, but using our magazines and some scratch building, we're gonna get really close to a nice replica of Jimmy Addison's Silver Bullet. Let's call it the plastic bullet for our purposes.
Were you a street racer or drag racer on Woodward Avenue?
I mean, way back, say in the 60s, you could street race out there. But then, as the cars got faster and faster, the cops were starting to crack down out there.
And what would it run?
Ran low 10s at 135.
Right. Now, I guess the big question, was the car ever defeated?
Not that I know of. Not that I can remember, anyway.
Now we know from history that Jimmy Addison was a good 4-speed driver, but the GTX, the Silver Bullet, was actually equipped with a 727 torque flight automatic. We're going to get rid of the A833 4-speed transmission on the Revell Hemi and replace it with a 727 torque flight. And the whole thing is, Jimmy Addison, his deal was, street racing. And the reality is, on most surfaces of streets, you don't have very good traction. So the violence of a 4-speed transmission could cause the rear tires to spin. So by contrast, an automatic transmission, which has a more gentle transition from gear to gear, would have a better shot at hooking up the car. So Addison ran a 727 torque flight. So what we're going to do is rob the 727 torque flight out of this model. This is the Golden Commandos, altered wheelbase Plymouth from Mobius Models. Great model. Someday down the road, maybe we'll build this one on camera. But in the meantime, we're going to scavenge parts out of this one. Yeah, cool. Here it is here. And again, that's a nice little 727. We'll snag that. So first up, we take each half of the Mobius, slice the Hemi off. All right, so there it is. The engine and tranny come apart. Okay, now we're going to separate the 4-speed, including the bell housing. All right. Okay, here's the Hemi block. Here's the torque flight. We'll glue things together now. Now, here's the thing about glue. Traditionally, people use, good old-fashioned Testors model cement. What this stuff does, basically, is it softens the plastic where it's applied, melts the plastic together, and when it dries, the two pieces of plastic are fused. The only trouble is it takes forever to dry, and I'm not that patient. So what I use is cyanoacrylate super glue, like this stuff here. And in fact, this stuff dries in about 3 minutes. If you're impatient like I am, you use Zip Kicker to make it dry in seconds. So that's what we're going to do. And run a bead along each surface of the block. And we'll paint this in a moment, obviously, but right here, I find it easier to mock the parts up and then paint them afterwards. So there's that. We want to make sure these things are happy and square. The oil pan rail is good. It is flat. That is cool. And that's done. That's the beauty of super glue. It's ready to go. You can almost fire this thing up. It's ready to go. Okay, let's do the same thing with the transmission halves. Top of the case here, a little bit of flash on that. And the 727 torque flight that we see here in 1/25th scale was initially made in 1962, and it was Detroit's first modern 3-speed automatic with an all-aluminum case. And the beauty is it was very light. Previous automatics were made of cast iron and aluminum, in many cases weighed up to 200 pounds. Torque flights are about 110, 115 pounds, and they can handle up to 600 horsepower. They're an excellent transmission. Okay, now these two things are aligned quite well. That's great. Now we can glue them together. There it is. That's the beauty of super glue. It's instant. Now, being a Hemi, it's time to put the cylinder heads onto the block, but I love how the block has got the deep skirts, the cross-bolted mains, just like a real 426 Hemi. Next up, oil pan, water pump, front dress. Now we can brush paint the block, an original of which is getting rarer and rarer, just like our little Plymouth here. The mighty Plymouth GTX, Plymouth's belated answer to the Pontiac GTO. Trouble is, only about 12,000 were built in 1967, and as a result, not a lot are available today, 55 years later. So it's not that uncommon to clone them like we're building a copy in plastic of the Jimmy Addison Silver Bullet. So what we have here looks to be a 67 GTX. It's got the fender emblem, Belvedere GTX, has the faux hood scoops, standard stuff on the GTX, and in the middle of the hood, 440 cubic inches on the emblem, so it looks like a GTX, but is it really? Well, if this was a 68, we could look right here at the VIN, but being a 67, this is the final year where Plymouth put the VIN on the door pillar. So we have to open the door, take a peek, and here we see RP23G7. Okay, RP means this car was born a satellite. It would be an RS23 to be a GTX. So right there we know it's a clone, which is fine. The fifth spot, G, this is a big block car. G is the 383 two-barrel with, I think, 305 horsepower in 1967. To be a GTX, we'd need to see L for the 375 horsepower 440 or J for the big 426 like Jimmy Addison had. Let's take a peek under the hood and see what we have. Ah, nice. Okay. Big block. This one is a tall deck. It's a 440. I like to see that. And of course, we know it's a 440 because there's a little square pad here, which indicates the RB tall deck wedge engine. The low decks don't have this. And again, we could have seen the 383 engine under the hood of this one, but it's nice to see the 383 came out, 440 went in. And the difference there, really, they have the same cylinder heads, oil pan, but the rest of the engine's largely different. The 440 has a longer stroke, a bigger bore than the 383, so there's more torque and horsepower. I like the details here. Got an Edelbrock dual plane intake manifold. Looks like a Performer RPM, a Holley 4-barrel carburetor, set of headers, and a heavy-duty radiator. Feels like probably a 3-row. That's good stuff. Manual drum brakes. That's cool. Power steering on this one. And electronic ignition conversion right there. No more points for a quick startup. So probably looking at about 400, 415 horsepower, something like that. So this probably runs pretty well. Not quite like the Hemi in Jimmy Addison's Silver Bullet, but certainly very capable of getting out of its own way. With the engine painted, now we can turn our attention to the intake manifold and the induction. But we happen to know, because of our vintage photographs in Carcraft, that Jimmy Addison ran a cross ram on his race Hemi. So what we do is we go into the parts bin, and I have all my special bits here from all model kits of all different types. And there's a company called Johan. They're out of business now, but they were one of the better model kit manufacturers back in the 60s and early 70s. And Johan does a really nice cross ram. And I have one right here. This is from the 64 Dodge Polara Superstocker. Now this has a pair of velocity stacks on it. We can see them right here. And Jimmy Addison ran this very manifold here on the Silver Bullet. So what we're going to do is take this and utilize it. I will detail it a little bit and maybe hide these carburetors, because these are a set of Carter AFBs right here that are not the most detailed things on the planet. But the good news is Addison also ran from time to time an A990 air cleaner, which is a large oval structure like this. To finish the engine, all I have to do is paint the transmission flat aluminum and then install the fan belt, alternator, fan, and then a little bit of detailing with the paintbrush on the engine, and the engine is all set. One detail about the GTX body is that the rear wheel openings aren't that big, so big fat slicks, well, you have to do something to increase ride height. Now, on a real GTX, you'd use super stock leaf springs or spring shackle extensions, but here what we're going to do is use a Bic lighter to heat the spring and bend it, and voila, instant ride height. So I just want to make sure that the ride height increase is enough. So we mock it up with the chassis and the body, and that's pretty good. And now we move on to the interior. Now, back in 1996, I had a telephone interview with Jimmy Addison, and he told me that he only ran one seat in the Silver Bullet when he was out in full kill mode. The back seat in the Revell model is kind of problematic. We have to get rid of it somehow. Well, the good news is that Revell also makes a 1968 Dodge Charger model, which is buildable with no back seat. So that takes care of the back seat, but what about up front? Well, Addison told me that when he was in full kill mode, super duper lightweight, he only had one seat in the car, and that was a driver's side seat from a Dodge van. So you say, where do we get one of those seats? Well, the good news is the Lindbergh, formerly IMC, Little Red Wagon kit comes with 2 of those seats. Now, being that it's the Little Red Wagon, the seats are molded in red plastic, which is not so good trying to paint. So what we do is spray it with flat white primer, so that when we hit it with the semi-flat black paint, it looks really good. So that takes care of the driver's side seat, and we can continue. One of the most important things about the Silver Bullet was the exhaust system. So before we get to that, I first have to mount the headers to the engine, and then we can mount the engine in the chassis and then begin building that cool Jimmy Addison specific 4-muffler exhaust. You can see right here in this vintage issue of Rod Ideas, there are 1, 2, 3, 4. There was 2 under the rockers and 2 in the usual location. Now what Jimmy did was very shrewd. If you're a street racer, what you don't want to do is announce your presence and make people afraid to run you. So by running 4 Cadillac mufflers, he muted the Hemi around town, but at wide open, had plenty of flow characteristics and didn't slow him down. So what we'll do is take the GTX mufflers out of the kit, these guys right here. I've got a spare kit, so I'll grab 4 of these mufflers, and then we'll use some Plastra tubing to connect them and replicate Jimmy's 4-muffler exhaust system. Okay, 2 go in the usual location.
Did it sound pretty mild, like a 383, or was it still pretty?
Oh, no, it sounds a whole lot healthier than that, because you had a half-inch stroker in it. That's with 490 inches, I don't care, you can put all kinds of mufflers on it. You're still going to get that basic pounding sound out of it.
1 connection down, 3 more to go.
And the 4 mufflers, did they help a lot keeping it quiet, or was it
helped a whole lot?
Well, that wraps up the 4-muffler exhaust. I think Jimmy Addison would be proud. But the final detail we have to correct is the wheels. The model kit from Revell, the 67 GTX, Sox and Martin, comes with Keystone wheels, which are nice but not correct. Jimmy Addison used Cragar SS mags, 15 by 5 in the front, 15 by 8 or so in the back. So we'll look into the magic box for those parts. And for tires, the issue is the stock tires that come in a Revell kit are these wide Goodyear radials. They're just not right for the car. So what we'll do is go to the Johan Chrysler turbine car. Very rare model, this thing right here. But in this are 4 excellent, thin Goodyear tires with really realistic tread pattern. And again, these are skinny tires. They're just what you would have found on the front of the Silver Bullet. So we're going to use these tires up front. And out back from AMT by round 2, we're going to go with their parts pack Goodyear slicks right here. They're Goodyear blue lines. And this is what Addison ran on the street. Yep, he always ran slicks. He wanted to be ready for any kind of action, and he was with drag slicks. These things hook pretty much anywhere. Cragar SS Mag is a classic of the hot rodding world, first seen in 1963 when Bell Auto Parts in Southern California had the exclusive right to sell them. Now, of course, Cragar was a company that made supercharger manifolds and things like that in the late 1950s and through the 60s. But they also struck upon the Cragar SS Mag wheel, and it was a big moneymaker. And to this very day, you can still get Cragar SS Mag wheels for your hot rod if you want a retro look. Please be a Cragar. Yes, good, we got them. Okay, we found a set of 4 Cragar SS Mags. They match. And we have some 15 by 8s for the back, some 15 by 5s for the front, skinny and wide, which is always a nice dynamic tension for a car. The car should always have skinny tires in the front, bigs in the back, like it's leaping, because that's what drag racers do. So one thing I have to do before I can use these is grind away the nubs on the outside. Now, these wheels are from the Mobius 1965 Mercury Comet Cyclone model kit. Great kit. But again, these are the wheels that came from that kit. So what I have to do is grind away the outer nub. Getting close. So now what I'll do is trim the inside of the tire. So here's the fronts and here's the rears. Jimmy Addison and his silver bullet are the stuff that legends are made of. We can all admit that street racing is dangerous, especially nowadays that you can walk into a dealership and drive home with over 800 horsepower. That puts a lot of horsepower into the hands of people who don't necessarily have the experience to handle it. When it comes to Jimmy Addison, sure, he was on the streets, but he was a bona fide drag racer. I mean, he was good enough for Chrysler to sponsor him and good enough to use his runs for research. That sounds pretty pro to me. Maybe our manufacturers will get out and start sponsoring local tracks to help keep them alive. That would be a great way to pay back the street racing culture and help build their R&D. But in the meantime, if you really want to go fast, get out and support your local track. Or if you just want to play the part, try building in 1/25th scale. It's a heck of a lot cheaper, that's for sure. I'm Steve Magnanti. Thanks for watching.